Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with another American citizen murdered in Minneapolis by U.S. Border Patrol officers who shot him 10 times after he was piled on and disarmed of his licensed pistol, which he never had in his hand. We recorded this interview on Saturday amid massive demonstrations against ICE and shutdowns and strikes, just after the shooting happened and before the sick and cynical lies poured out of DHS Secretary Noem in an orchestrated attempt by this criminal administration to have us not believe our eyes and accept the insult that government thugs we are paying for can kill us when they please, and it's all the fault of Democrats. Joining us is Radley Balko, an award-winning independent investigative journalist based in Nashville, Tennessee. He formerly worked for the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Reason magazine, and has been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous other publications. His books include The Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces, and The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist. And we'll discuss his articles at the New Republic, Trump's Immigration Nightmare, It Is Happening Here, and at the New York Times, I've covered police abuse for 20 years. What ICE is doing is different. Then we will move from the domestic terrorism waged on American citizens by the Trump administration to the international disaster of Trump's thuggish foreign policy and speak with our second guest, who wrote that, quote, "We are drifting towards a world that looks far less like the liberal universalism of 1945 and far more like the balance of power order of the late 19th century, spheres of influence, managed rivalry, and transactional diplomacy. The United States will dominate the Western Hemisphere, China will dominate the Asia-Pacific, Russia will contest Europe's eastern frontier, international law will persist, but as rhetoric rather than restraint. There are no obvious winners in this world. Economic growth will fall as trade walls rise. Border-blind threats to health, to the environment, to financial stability will rise as cooperation fails, and wars will be quicker to start and harder to end." Joining us is Benn Steil, Director of International Economics and the historian in residence at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the author of Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of a New World Order, and The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War. His latest book is The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fight of the American Century. And we will discuss his article at the Dispatch, The Paradox America Can No Longer Sustain. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Radley Balko, an award-winning independent investigative journalist based in Nashville, Tennessee. His books include Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of American Police Forces, and he has an article at the New Republic, Trump's Immigration Nightmare, It Is Happening Here, and another at the New York Times, I've covered police abuse for 20 years. What ICE is doing is different. Welcome to Background Briefing, Radley Balko.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And amid demonstrations against ICE and shutdowns and strikes in Minneapolis over this weekend, another American citizen was shot dead by U.S. Border Patrol officers. And it would seem to me, Radley, that it's difficult to believe anything coming out of the Trump administration, let alone from Tricia McLaughlin, the spokeswoman for DHS, as much as it's difficult to believe anything coming out of Putin and the Kremlin. Is that where we're at in America today?
Unfortunately, it is. We've seen them lie after these incidents, after the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, but also after shootings by immigration officers in Chicago. And already within hours of the shooting on Saturday, Greg Bovino held a press conference in which he claimed that Mr. Preddy, the man who was killed, was a domestic terrorist, that he intended to massacre police officers and to maximize damage. That was as they were holding that press conference, another video from another angle came out, which just further put the lie to those statements. Mr. Preddy was clearly recording officers on his cell phone. He had come to the aid of a woman who looks like she was knocked down by one of the officers, at which point they jumped Mr. Preddy. I've seen frame by frame analysis of the video, including by the Bellingcat people, which pretty clearly shows one of the officers removes Mr. Preddy's handgun from the back of his pants as they have him on the ground. At no point does he brandish the weapon. There's no video showing him brandishing the weapon. He had a license to conceal carry in the state of Minnesota, which means he had the gun on him legally. So the idea, they're already trying to call this guy a domestic terrorist. They're already claiming that he planned to massacre police officers. There is zero evidence for any of that. What appears to have happened is they were irritated that someone was recording them. They were irritated that he came to the aid of this woman that they had knocked down. They jumped him. They've removed a gun from him, and then they opened fire and shot him. And from the video I've seen, I counted at least 10 shots that I can hear, including several after he was clearly incapacitated.
So this is as brutal, if not more brutal, than the killing of Renee Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think the killing of Renee Good was also a crime. It doesn't appear that it's going to be prosecuted or treated that way or even investigated. It looks like local officials in Minnesota and state officials are making a more aggressive move to take over the investigation of this one. I do think they're going to have to fight the federal government. They can carry out their own independent investigation. They can charge this officer in federal court. The Trump administration can try to fight it, but they can't prevent that. They can prevent local law enforcement from accessing evidence that the FBI itself collects. That's what happened with Renee Good. But I would also say, after Renee Good, when the initial FBI agent started investigating that shooting, she thought there was ample evidence to conduct a criminal civil rights investigation. She was overruled, and instead, the Department of Justice opened criminal investigations into Good herself and her surviving spouse. And because of that FBI agent resigned, and 6 federal prosecutors resigned in protest. I think we are going to see this administration try to pressure the people who remain in the FBI office and at DHS and at DOJ to do something similar. And I guess we'll see if there's anyone with any integrity left in those offices.
Well, this weekend, the Sunday Times magazine and the New York Times has a lengthy investigation into the state of the FBI under Kash Patel, and it is dismal. It is so sad. Not that most of my left-wing audience here have too many sympathies for the FBI, but now they just simply don't do counterterrorism. They don't do fraud, white-collar crime. They don't do anything to protect America as they used to do. All they do is immigration, and anybody that has seniority, has institutional knowledge, has experience, has been purged, and all that's left is a bunch of sycophants, and the same is true of the cabinet that Trump has. So this is a very Orwellian time, it would seem, because in terms of foreign policy, Trump is attacking our allies and friends while cozying up to our enemies like Putin. And the same thing's happening domestically, where you have federal law enforcement attacking, harassing, and shooting American citizens in the streets of Minneapolis, while the government does everything it can to exonerate the killers.
I mean, not just exonerate, they're not even pretending to conduct an impartial investigation. I mean, this administration has said from the start, from the very, in the first days after he was inaugurated, that they believe that federal law enforcement officers have absolute immunity from any sort of criminal culpability, no matter what they do. And that's wrong on the law. They have a form of immunity when it comes to civil liability in terms of suing them for violating your constitutional rights. But there is no such thing as federal criminal immunity, except for the president, unfortunately, thanks to the Supreme Court. But when you take these federal agents and you tell them you're unleashing them or you're taking the cuffs off of them, as Trump has done in the past, when you tell them that they are absolutely immune from criminal liability, that they are literally above the law, that they cannot be held criminally accountable. And then you tell them that the people who are trying to record them and trying to apply some sort of accountability are domestic terrorists. When you tell them that the immigrants that they're confronting and detaining and arresting are, vermin who poison the blood of the country, you are creating, the precise type of situation where we're going to see these sorts of violent incidents. And frankly, I don't think that the administration really cares. I think that I certainly don't think they care about, Mr. Preddy or Miss Good, but I'm not even sure they care if there's a violent backlash. I think that just gives Trump an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act and send them to the military, which is what he's wanted to do since 2020.
Right, and they also don't have to adhere to the Fourth Amendment, right?
I mean, they don't have to adhere to any of the amendments. I mean, I come from a fairly libertarian background, and I've known a lot of staunch Second Amendment supporters, and the reason that they say we need a Second Amendment and why it goes back to the founding, which I do support gun rights. I don't go quite as far as some people do. But the reason that they cite is to prevent government tyranny, to provide a check against government abuses. Well, here was a guy in Minneapolis who applied for and obtained a legal concealed carry permit, who had, his weapon on him, and who was, doing what he thought was opposing tyranny. He was clearly looking out for his neighbors. He was trying to protect people who the government has been using violence against. We've seen, over the last several days, the use of this kind of violence against children, against people who are here legally and are seeking asylum and are doing what they're supposed to be doing, who are showing up for court. This guy was peacefully, but also while armed, concealed armed, protecting these people from what he saw as government tyranny. And he was not only was he murdered for that, the government is citing the fact that he was exercising his Second Amendment rights as its justification for killing him. So, yeah, I don't think they have much respect for any of the Bill of Rights, frankly.
But is this to say then, Radley Balko, that what they're trying to do is to display their cruelty, display their callousness, display their omnipotence, to tell us that you can't do anything about it? We have immunity, we can kill you, so you better not act up.
I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion. When I've covered police shootings in the past, and I've been doing this for more than 20 years, when there's a police shooting, the police agency involved will put out a statement. And, prior to the last couple of months, those statements always at least sort of pay lip service to the idea of an impartial investigation, right? They want to be seen as legitimate. Now, these investigations aren't always legitimate. A lot of times police officers are cleared who shouldn't be. There's bias in the way internal affairs investigations are conducted, the way they interview people, the way officers are interviewed. but at least there's something to be said for the police agency still wanting to be perceived as legitimate, still wanting the public to believe in them, to believe that they're accountable. What we've seen from this administration is they just don't care. They want you to think that they can get away with whatever they want because that's how they exert their power, right? They want you to fear them. They want you to think that if you try to record them, as happened after Renee Good, they have the ability and the power to use violence against you up to and including killing you.
Well, in contrast to the appalling behavior of ICE, their lack of training, their arrogance, their impunity, and their stupidity, the police chief of Minneapolis seems to be the example of the right kind of policing, is he not?
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge the history in Minneapolis, right? So after the murder of George Floyd, the city there was also a subsequent DOJ investigation, civil rights investigation that found rampant constitutional violations, civil rights violations, abuse of force, and racism within the Minneapolis Police Department. And so the city sought to reform and rebuild the police department. And so they brought in the current police chief as part of that effort. And he has worked hard to rebuild trust in the community, between the community and the police. And he gave a great interview with the New York Times podcast, The Daily, where he talked about how what the federal government is doing right now is undermining that trust, and it's also putting his own officers at risk because it's fomenting public anger and animosity against anybody wearing a badge and a uniform. He's also, I mean, they're also hampering local police in other ways. They're getting overwhelmed with 911 calls because these officers are detaining people in their cars and then just leaving their cars in the middle of the street. In some cases, they've left them in gear. There was another case where they left a dog in the back seat of a car. They blocked the roads, and so people call 911 to get the cars removed. But also, just generally, people are calling the police because they're scared because they're getting into their own confrontations with immigration officers. And he's angry about it, and he should be. And then we saw another police chief in Brooklyn Park, which is just outside of Minneapolis, his own press conference where he said his own officers, while off duty, are being racially profiled by immigration officials, federal immigration officials, including one that had a gun pointed at her. So yeah, I mean, I think the city is trying to reform its police department, is trying to build that trust. And you can't police a city without trust. You have to earn the trust of the community in order to be able to effectively police a city. And what the federal government is doing right now, and what Trump has been going back to his first term has done, is really undermine that trust and make it more difficult to keep cities safe, and that undermines public safety.
So, Radley, Balko, do you see this then as a political move on the part of Trump to go after a Democratic state and a Democratic city in the middle of the country that's the only blue state in an otherwise sort of red sweep that the Republicans have been getting lately in elections? That seems to be more than coincidental. And is this a precursor, a rehearsal for perhaps having the Insurrection Act invoked, and sometime later in the year, closer to the midterm elections, Trump would deploy soldiers and ICE in Democratic cities to intimidate them, as they are intimidating people in Minneapolis as we speak, in order to discourage voting or even shut down voting?
So, I think they can try to intimidate people from voting during midterms. I don't think they can shut down the midterms because they're administered at the state and local level. They also just don't have enough officers to do this across the entire country. But I could definitely see them trying to target important districts or important precincts. But I don't think there's any question that this is what Trump is doing here is politically motivated. They have their sort of legal justifications for these surges, right? In Los Angeles, they claimed that protests were stopping immigration officers from doing their jobs. In Chicago and DC, they tried to cite the crime rate, which they lied about. In Portland, they said they had to deploy too many officers to protect this immigration detention facility. And in all those cases, federal courts found that they were lying, and some came pretty close to explicitly saying that. I think others used more diplomatic language, but they found basically that the Trumps Trump administration's justifications for these surges were at odds with the reality on the ground. Same thing in Minneapolis, right? Trump claims that this is about fighting fraud and fraud by Somali immigrants and Somali Americans. But that fraud was already being prosecuted. And in fact, the federal prosecutor who was heading up that investigation ended up resigning because he was angry about the lack of an investigation into the killing of Renee Good. So they undermined their own investigation. But then Trump himself, he lets the mask slip in these cases, right? He came right out and said a couple of weeks ago that the real reason that he was sending these forces into Minneapolis was because he thinks he won the state 3 times and that local officials stole the election from him. In Los Angeles, during a press conference, we saw Kristi Noem, the DHS secretary, say that federal troops were going to stay in Los Angeles until they liberated the city from its socialist political leaders. These are not legitimate reasons to use federal force in a city. And there's a reason why they're not making these arguments in court. But I think that, we know Trump, right? I mean, we know that he's about retribution. He's about, petty grievances. And we know that he's always wanted his own muscle, right? His own paramilitary force that he can send in to, settle scores and inflict pain and suffering on his enemies. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing.
Well, Radley, you've got the German press pointing out similarities between Greg Bavino's overcoat and the Gestapo garb, and you've got Stephen Miller, who is absolutely percolating with hatred and delusions about most of America. He thinks half of America are a bunch of communist terrorists. I mean, he keeps saying that, and then you've got these trolls inside the White House that digitally altered the image of this woman that was arrested. She's a pastor. She went into this church in Minneapolis, I think it was last weekend, to confront the pastor, who apparently is the head of ICE in Minneapolis, but his parishioners don't know that. And she challenged him to own up to who he really was and what he does in his otherwise pastoral time. And she got arrested, and they digitally altered the image of her to make her look, blacker and weaker and in tears, etc. I mean, is this what we're paying our government people to do?
Sure seems like it. This is an administration that deliberately rehired people that it had deemed too racist to work for it during Trump's first term, right? Stephen Miller himself has well-documented ties to white nationalist and white supremacist groups. He's, praised and promoted their work in the past. There have been plenty of investigative journalism projects on that. Just a couple of weeks ago, ICE announced that one of their prosecutors, one of the people that prosecutes immigrants in court, who had been temporarily suspended for making racist comments on social media, including praising Hitler, would be getting his job back. So a guy who was praising Hitler on social media gets to go back to arguing about why immigrants, almost all of whom are non-white, should be deported. This is not an administration that cares about propriety, justice, decency. This is an administration that cares about inflicting pain on its enemies and on people who, it doesn't think are worthy of our sort of kindness and respect as fellow human beings.
But as ugly as Miller is, and uglier still are the people that stormed the Capitol on January the 6th. We all saw what lowlifes they are, and they've all been freed, and many of them have joined ICE, apparently. In the ivory tower of the Supreme Court, you have these white gentlemen like Kavanaugh, who basically have given ICE a green light to basically racially profile. They're not picking up white people. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of white immigrants from Eastern Europe and other countries like Melania that are working in bars in New York and in Boston, etc. They're not rounding them up. they're going after brown people. And Kavanaugh has given them a green light, has he not?
He did give them a green light in the concurring opinion. I think in the case that came out of Los Angeles, he was roundly ridiculed for that, and people started referring to Kavanaugh stops. Another part of that decision that was particularly galling was that Kavanaugh was claiming that if you're a U.S. citizen or legal resident and you get stopped, it's at worst a minor inconvenience and you'll be released after a few minutes. And we just know for the fact that that's not what's happening. I mean, we've seen U.S. citizens and legal residents being arrested, in some cases deported, but in most cases detained for hours, sometimes days, denied access to their attorneys. And so Kavanaugh, in a subsequent opinion, in a footnote, said that, of course it's still illegal to use race as your sole basis for stopping someone. By that point, I think the cat was out of the bag, and it's going to be hard to go back to the way things were before. But the other problem is that there's no real incentive for these officers to follow the law. I mean, even if the Supreme Court told them they had to stop racially profiling, there's really no mechanism to enforce that. The only way to enforce it at the federal level would be to enforce it with criminal charges in federal court, and that would have to be brought by the Trump administration. And we know that they're not going to do that. They don't have any real liability, as I already mentioned, for in terms of civil liability. So if they violate your constitutional rights, it's difficult and almost impossible for you to sue them in federal court. The best hope that we have of any kind of accountability is in at least any kind of legal accountability is in state criminal court. But again, that requires these state officials to fight the federal government and try to bring these criminal charges. They would end up getting removed to federal court, and that's a tall order to ask of people. I will say there is one other way of holding rogue government actors accountable, and that's through citizens. That's by social shaming. You see a immigration officer in a viral video, ripping a kid out of his mother's arms, and you go to church with that person, or you live next to them, or you see them at your son's basketball game and you shun them and you tell them they should be ashamed of themselves. And that kind of social pressure can work, but it doesn't work if they're all covering their faces so that nobody can figure out who they are. And I think that's a big reason why we're seeing the masking that we are.
But you have to admit, just in the last couple of minutes here, Radley, that they hate women. They hate white women, particularly the woman that they shot. And they sort of, after she was shot, the ICE officers referred to her as an effing bitch. And another one sort of told a demonstrator that, if you better not misbehave because you'll end up like that lesbian bitch. This is the sort of attitude they have. You have to admire these women, these housewives, these ordinary citizens who are facing off, because they are clearly, that's the enemy of ICE, isn't it? Liberal white women are the enemy of ICE, and they're certainly the enemy of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump.
I mean, yeah, I think it's liberal white women. I think it's just people. I mean, as poorly as our institutions have served us, the capitulation of politicians, law firms, universities, corporations. What I've taken heart in is seeing the power of just everyday people to stand up to this administration. I mean, yesterday in Minneapolis, I think the temperature was -10, and you had, I believe it was over 100,000 people show up downtown to protest ICE and demand that they get out of the city. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think, we've seen women like Renee Good and other women across the city stand up to them today. Mr. Preddy, who was shot and killed, 37-year-old white man who's a registered nurse, I think with the Veterans Administration, if I read correctly. We're seeing, people all over Minneapolis get out. They're braving not just, cold, dangerously cold temperatures, but literal, assault and violence by their government against them in order to stand up for their neighbors and to stick up for people. You have
And the Constitution.
and the Constitution and people, it's not just about protesting and confronting agents and blowing whistles. I mean, you have brigades of people who are doing laundry for immigrant families who are afraid to leave their homes. You have people buying food and groceries for them. Again, to their own, putting themselves out there. I mean, people who are getting groceries are now being stopped by ICE, who are trying to find the address of the person that they're delivering to. And, they're being told now to have that address on a piece of paper that they can eat quickly so that ICE can't get the address off of them. That is where we are now. I mean, that's the kind, that's the sort of thing that like, I hate to just always go back to Nazi Germany, but I mean, this is supposed to be a free society, a free country, a democratic country, and we're literally telling people who are trying to buy food for their neighbors that they should eat the neighbor's address so that the federal government can't get it and can't go seize those people.
Well, Radley Balko, we've run out of time, but I appreciate you joining us here. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And again, I've been speaking with Radley Balko, who's an award-winning independent investigative journalist based in Nashville, Tennessee. He formerly worked for the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and Reason magazine, and has been published by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous other publications. His books include Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces, and The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist. And he has an article, The New Republic, Trump Immigration Nightmare, It's Happening Here, and another at the New York Times, I've covered police abuse for 20 years. What ICE is doing is different. We're going to take a brief station break and back and moving away from domestic terrorism waged on American citizens by the Trump administration to the international disaster of Trump's thuggish foreign policy. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Benn Steil, the Director of International Economics and the Historian in Residence at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the author of Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of the New World Order, and The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War. And his latest book is The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fate of the American Century. And he has an article at The Dispatch, The Paradox America Can No Longer Sustain. Welcome to Background Briefing, Benn Steil.
Thanks for having me back, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ben. And on Wednesday, before the World Economic Forum in Davos, President Trump said that Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make statements. And, of course, now on Saturday, President Trump has threatened 100% tariffs on Canada if it makes a trade deal with China. So Trump's basically saying Canada lives because of the United States, and now he's more or less saying Canada can die because of the United States. So what happened here? Because our closest friend and neighbor is the number one villain as far as Trump's concerned, and he's beating up in Canada at the same time giving Putin a free pass. And in a curious way, it's happening domestically, where you've got ICE beating up the residents and terrorizing them and shooting the residents of Minneapolis and Minnesota. At the same time, the ICE officer who killed the woman, shot her 3 times, he's being protected. So it seems that what's happening now is so topsy-turvy, both domestically and in foreign policy. I just don't get it.
Yeah, well, you're not the only one, Ian. I think the first thing to emphasize is that the common cord binding all those disparate acts of belligerence together is the person of Donald J. Trump. The belligerence towards Canada, for example, or I should say in particular, is not shared anywhere within the American political establishment. This is an obsession of Donald Trump. And so that common cord binding these actions together, I believe, is his psychological disposition, this absolutely overwhelming desire to dominate. And if you look at the political figures that Trump admires historically, for example, James Polk, whose portrait now adorns the Oval Office, they are presidents who expanded U.S. territory. Trump is not interested in any abstract idea of a world order. He's absolutely hostile to the notion of there being international rules. He's been openly disdainful of the very idea of international law. He said recently, I don't need it. I rely on my morals. And those morals, such as they may be, are certainly not readily apparent to any of us. So this is an extremely dangerous situation. It's difficult to see how it's going to be diffused in short order. Madisonian democracy in the United States, that is, with three co-equal branches of government balancing each other out, has been, for all intents and purposes, obliterated. We have an executive branch run by one person, which is dominating the entire policy landscape.
But in your article, Benn Steil, at the Dispatch, The Paradox America Can No Longer Sustain, you say that the world order is undergoing a brutal demolition by Trump.
Yes.
But there's more going on than just the pathologies of one personality. So
absolutely. What I do argue in the piece is that there has always been a paradox underlying liberal universalism. And that paradox, as it were, lay dormant for most of the 80-year post-war history, and is only recently becoming significant geopolitically. And let me explain what I mean. The whole idea of a liberal rules-based order has only one overarching feature or command, as it were. It doesn't dictate values except the one that says that all decisions must be made according to rules that are laid down by advance. So it's procedural. But as many political and juridical scholars have commented over the course of the 20th century, that there are problems with a system like that extrapolates from values. And that is, it cannot guarantee effective or timely decisions. So the United States, during most of the post-war period, operated both inside this rules-based order that it established and outside, as it were, steering and directing it. That worked pretty well while the United States balanced the need for pursuing, for example, foreign policy objectives that were in its self-interest, but could also be made to accord with global interest. It balanced that with the need to respect the system. So the example that I would give is George W. Bush's conduct of the first Gulf War in 1990, 1991. This is a war that obviously could not have taken place without the initiative of the United States and the person of the US president, but it went through UN procedures that had been established by the United States back in 1945. There was a UN resolution authorizing the military action, and the United States did not go beyond that authorization. In other words, we didn't march troops to Baghdad. We didn't engage in regime change. That started breaking down in the early 2000s. And one of the features, I would argue the major feature leading the system to break down, was the rise of China. And the fact that these international institutions and rules established by the United States, particularly with regard to the operations of the World Trade Organization, simply could not be enforced against China. And so the United States started moving away from this trade-off where traditionally it had given up short-term advantage for long-term stability. It said this was no longer a bargain we could afford. And I think Donald Trump is the product of that. I don't believe that the American public ever intended for the destruction of world order to go anywhere near this far, but it opened the doors to that sort of development.
Well, Bush Sr., of course, you just explained
Right.
what he did in terms of working with the international institutions, particularly the UN. His son did the opposite
Exactly.
in Iraq, and now that's given Putin permission to invade Ukraine. But what explains the hostility that Trump, Vance, Hegseth, they all seem to have this incredible hatred of Europe, which is hard to
Yeah.
fathom. They never really explain why. And Trump, in his Davos speech on Wednesday, attacked the Europeans without providing any evidence why he hates them. Let's face it, the Europeans have, in many ways, a better quality of life than we do, and in many ways, particularly the Northern Europeans, have a higher standard of living. It seems to me what this is an attack on social democracy. And I know you've studied the Marshall Plan and that whole era very, very thoroughly, Ben. And I always found it a paradox that the United States essentially encouraged social democracy in Germany and Japan and other European countries as a hedge against communism, but they denied it here in the United States. And when you have people like Trump attacking social democracy and everything, health care and the environment and you name it, he's hostile to all of those things. It makes me wonder whether that's somehow the agenda here, that we're a country that's being denied the simple value of a transaction where you pay your taxes and you get government services.
Well, let me connect what I was saying previously about liberalism to the developments that you just pointed to. What's the common denominator here? Those people you mentioned, such as Vance and Hegseth, certainly Donald Trump, disdain liberalism. And why? It's because liberalism is founded in respect for rules and procedures. It doesn't impose any values beyond that. And Donald Trump divides the world basically into winners and suckers. And the European Union, in his mind, are suckers because they can't take quick and effective decisions, that they're bound down by their rules and their proceduralism. And so Vance and Hegseth look at Europe, they say it's pathetic, they say it's declining, and it's not able to take firm demonstrative action to stop it. The sort of firm demonstrative action that they believe they're taking to save the United States today.
But they're siding with the spoilers in Europe, with the Orbans, and they've, even with his billion-dollar a head board of peace, he's invited Orban on, but he's also invited Putin, for God's sake, and also the Belarusian dictator. So it's not as if this is just a sort of political argument. He's actively courting the spoilers. And Vance is courting the neo-Nazi AfD, for God's sake, in Germany.
Right. Well, for 80 years since the end of the Second World War, the institutions that we established as offshoots of the Marshall Plan, such as the European Coal and Steel Community and NATO, these were all meant to guarantee the survival of a liberal democratic order in Europe, right, Ian? Well, Trump has nothing but disdain for that. he's more than happy to see it broken up. He really doesn't care about order in Europe, and he doesn't associate it with peace and prosperity in the United States. So, I mean, the way we're inexorably moving is back towards a 19th century spheres of influence, balance of power, spatial dominance order, with the United States dominating in the Western Hemisphere, China dominating in the Asia Pacific, and Putin increasingly contesting the eastern frontiers of Europe. This is a very dangerous world, but that's not how Donald Trump sees it. With regard to this Board of Peace, I think it's an exceptionally dangerous development. As you know, Trump has appointed himself chairman with extraordinary powers to control who the other members are and what they can and cannot do. And very importantly, he's chairman for life. So he could continue on as chairman even under a new president of the United States. He will have billions of dollars under his control and will be able to use that to pursue an international agenda, part of which will certainly be to enrich himself and his family, even after he's formally out of power in the United States. So it's an extremely worrying development.
But this idea of dividing the world up like mafia bosses, where Xi Jinping, you get Asia, Vladimir, you get Russia and what you can grab in Eastern Europe,
right,
and I get the Western Hemisphere. The origins of that are none other than Alexander Dugin, this crazy Russian nationalist. So,
who, of course, Ian, is a devotee of Carl Schmitt, the famous Nazi jurist and staunch anti-liberal. So this goes back well into early 20th century history.
So again, you get back to Putin. And do you have any ideas, Ben, why Trump continually defers to Putin? Because breaking up NATO, going to war over Greenland, that's just a massive gift to Putin. And all you have to do is look at the Russian media and what they're saying over there. They're just absolutely over the moon.
Completely. But you have to understand, Trump doesn't see Putin as a threat. Right now, as you know, Putin is focused on Ukraine, and Trump doesn't give a damn about Ukraine. If Putin would be happy taking 20% of Ukrainian territory and Trump promising not to let them into NATO, that would be absolutely fine with Donald Trump. He really doesn't give a damn what happens to Ukraine. As to countries further east, you know, the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, he doesn't even know where they are. And quite importantly, he could say the American public doesn't know where they are and doesn't know that we have any treaty obligations to them. So why should I really care? This doesn't affect my interest. At least that's how he sees it.
So you conclude your article, Ben, by saying that in terms of whether this world divided up by the US having the Western Hemisphere, China having Asia, and Russia having Russia and what they can grab in East Europe, you say, in this world, there are no obvious winners in this world. Economic growth will fall as trade walls rise. Border-blind threats to health, the environment, to financial stability will rise as cooperation falls. Wars will be quicker to start and harder to end. This world was always latent in liberal universalism itself. Trump did not invent its contradictions. He merely stripped them of their euphemisms. So, given that bleak prognosis, I guess we have to get to what you also mentioned in your article. Why did the American people vote for this man twice? And what kind of support is there? Because I recall his first chief of staff, General Kelly, who didn't really speak out sufficiently, neither did Mattis and others, about what they saw, because we know that they were appalled by Trump's amateurism, ignorance, recklessness. But nevertheless, one thing that I do recall that General Kelly said about Trump was the American people have got to be better educated about who they vote for.
Absolutely.
And that's what it comes down to. So do you have any answers there?
Yeah, they're not good ones, Ian, in the sense that I'll give you an intellectually crafted answer, but not one I can really understand viscerally, and I think you'll share my feelings in that regard. You've probably met Trump supporters before who basically come across as decent, well-meaning people. And when they explain why they voted for him, it's mostly not because they liked him personally, or they respected his views of world order. They were voting against something. What was that something? Well, I often heard mentioned the chaos on the southern border, the unrestrained illegal migration into the country. That was one thing. Rampant inflation, as we had under the Biden administration for a period. They wanted someone else to come in and fix those problems. So they didn't necessarily identify Donald Trump as the perfect candidate for that role, but they saw him as the embodiment of forces against unrestrained migration, against soaring inflation. They were generally voting against something. But as we can see, they got far more than they bargained for.
Right, and the person that they were running against, of course, was fading physically and mentally, but now we are seeing manifestly before our eyes how Trump is deteriorating even faster than Biden.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you listen to his rambling talks, they literally make no coherent sense. The facts are completely invented. The logic is also often self-contradictory. And there's literally no coherence there. And it's tragic that he's built a cabinet around him that understands that their hold on power depends on support for this man who's clearly in serious cognitive decline and does not acknowledge any of the normal restraints that a democracy imposes on the elected executive branch leader. It's exceptionally disturbing. I mean, you mentioned some figures from the first Trump administration. You know, I would add McMaster to that list. These were people who were basically decent, thoughtful, intelligent, and well-meaning, but they were sidelined and pushed out. This time, Trump has been much more careful to appoint people who would never challenge him. And that's why we've seen a lot more stability in this administration. Of course, bringing such people in meant bringing in people who are, on the whole, grossly unqualified. People like RFK as Health Secretary, Pam Bondi, Hegseth, you mentioned, Kash Patel. But again, Trump is not looking for people who will advise him on how he could do things differently than he wishes to do them. He's looking for people who will support his agenda. And as you know, that often means destroying what he considers to be his enemies.
But just in closing, Ben Steil, what it seems to be, what we're going to be getting more of is more distractions, because he is a reality TV guy. That's what he knows most of all. He changes the subject. He always has a cliffhanger. Wait for the next episode. It's all a distraction from some of the serious problems, but also, more than anything, it's a distraction from the release of the Epstein files. And when you talk about Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice, it's an absolute disgrace that there is a law that was passed by House and Senate and signed by Trump himself that demanded the release of those files over a month ago, and only 1% of them have been released. And it's pretty clear that they are just defying everybody because Trump says, I do not want that information out, and we don't know the extent to which it's damaging to him, but I think the assumption is that it's incredibly damaging.
And judges around the nation, even Ian, even some Trump-appointed judges have been absolutely scathing in all these cases to do with the limitations or absence thereof of his powers, have been absolutely damning of the administration for lying to the court and for refusing to obey its orders. I mean, this man and this administration simply has no regard for law, and it's exceptionally disturbing.
Well, Ben Steil, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Ben Steil, who's Director of International Economics and the Historian in Residence at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the author of The Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of the New World Order, of a New World Order, and The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War. And his latest book is The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fate of the American Century. And he has an article at The Dispatch, The Paradox America Can No Longer Sustain. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more